If you're not already on the Data Skeptic newsletter, and we send it out same day as the show, so if you haven't seen that, you're not on the list. Head over to dataskeptic.com, scroll down just a little bit, and put your email in the box. You'll get an extended bio on the guest and a little behind-the-scenes stuff. In fact, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to reveal what the next season's topic will be to the newsletter list first. So if you'd like to know in advance of January 2023, sign up now at dataskeptic.com. We learned last episode the manner in which advertisers track you online is evolving. Ironically, the movement away from third-party cookies means that third-party tracking, which used to be done somewhat out in the open, has now been moved server-side where we don't see it. Corporations rarely disclose details about the algorithmic mechanisms that define their systems. So any insight about data sharing that takes place between these sites has to be measured through experimentation. How much data sharing is going on? Find out in today's interview.
My name is Maaz bin Musa. I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Iowa, and I'm working on auditing data sharing ecosystems online, which essentially means I want to make the ecosystem more transparent in the sense that we know who is collecting our data, who is sharing it, what's happening to our data. And more recently, I've also been involved in the compliance side of this process as to how compliant these entities are or what the state-of-the-art regulations are surrounding these compliance regulations.
And I'm Rishab, assistant professor at the University of Iowa's Computer Science Department. I do internet measurement with a focus on trying to understand how data that is gathered by entities actually impacts our experiences on the internet.
Well, how did you first get interested in the topic of data sharing?
Data sharing is the second part of what my interests are, and I'll elaborate that further. So I was interested in, like I said, auditing data sharing ecosystems or data ecosystems online. And there are two major parts of it, in my opinion. One is data gathering, and the other is data sharing. So there has been a lot of work that has been done on data gathering. And one example of that, maybe you've heard of it, it's cookie syncing. Anything that enables entities to gather your data has been studied a lot, and there has been significant work on that. But what was not clear or what was not studied in detail was what happens to that data after it has been gathered. So we essentially wanted to answer that question. And our specific work, Atom, which focuses on data sharing, was also motivated by a previous work similar to this, which used advertising bid values to identify these data sharings on the server side. And Atom was a more generalizable way for doing the same thing.
Well, if I visit a website, let's say like an e-commerce store, and I look at, all men's clothing or something like that, if I come back later and it seems to remember that I'm interested in men's clothing, I don't, it's the same exact site. I know there's a cookie there. I personally don't feel like that's a privacy concern. But it would be a little surprising to me if then I went to a different clothing store that I'd never been to before, and they knew already in advance I was interested in men's clothing. Is that a possibility?
That's not just a possibility, that is actually what is happening. And the only two works surrounding data sharing, one of them focuses on exactly this thing, which is called ad retargeting. So they sort of figure out how data sharing happens based on the exact phenomena that you mentioned, which is you visit a website, you show an interest somewhere, and then you visit another website and they seem to know your interest over there. So there presumably happened some sharing on the back end which enabled the other site to know that, or the advertiser on the other site to know that you are interested. So that not just is a possibility, that is what's happening in reality as well.
Are there any legal boundaries about what is and is not allowed in terms of the sharing?
This is a more recent thing than anything else. So there weren't any data regulations in place before the most famous one that you will probably be aware of, which is the GDPR, but that was only and is only restricted to Europe. And the most famous one, or the first one in US, was the CCPA, which is now being followed up by each state's own data rights policy. But they only are in their initial stages, and they have multiple more iterations to go before they have much better regulations in them.
Basically, there's nothing illegal about what is happening online right now. Online tracking, retargeting, data gathering is not really illegal. The CCPA only goes as far as saying that if your data has been gathered by certain entities, and this is again specific to California residents, if their data has been gathered by specific entities, these entities just have to follow these rules and provide the ability for these California residents to opt out of this data sharing or to opt out of the data gathering or request that their data be deleted. That's as far as regulations go. And this is true for Europe as well with the GDPR.
Could you give me a sense, maybe it's your own intuition or there's something empirical about this, but to what degree is that process frictionless? If I say I don't want to be tracked, do I have to fill out a postcard and mail it to the right department, or is it really something as simple for the average person to execute on?
With respect to CCPA or even GDPR, there are very less standardized methodologies out there that allow a person to, globally remove people or stop people from selling their data or sharing their data. In CCPA at least, or in US at least, or in CCPA, there are very less to zero standardizations. And there have been recent researches on GDPR as well on how they can be standardized as well. For example, there's a right of making your data more portable, but there isn't a portal that allows, or there isn't a standard that allows your data to be exported or imported in a certain manner. And same goes for other rights as well. If, for example, there's a right to delete your data, but there is not a standardized platform where you can go and just tick off all the rights that have your data and get them to delete. Every advertiser or every data broker has their own web form or own way, which is usually an email or a web form or a telephone number at the least, which you can, call or email to exercise your right.
Yeah, so if you look at the CCPA right now, there's about 450 data brokers that are registered with the Attorney General in California because they handle, I believe it's over 50,000 residents' data, California residents' data sets. To opt out entirely from this ecosystem of data sharing, an individual would have to go over the CCPA relevant parts of the privacy policies of 450 different data brokers, figure out what methods or what mechanisms each of these policies facilitate for exercising their rights, and then act on 450 individual methods.
When we think of offline versus online behaviors, I don't know that we always can make an apples to oranges comparison of that the privacy abstract concept carries across, but in the real world, no one would think that their credit card company would share the statement with your employer. That's just such a big no-no. But when I have data behind the scenes, if I'm fingerprinted and there's server-side work going on, I really don't have any clarity into who might be connecting data sets behind the scenes. Do I have cause for concern about that sort of thing?
I believe so, and we shared the same concern, which is why we did this work to uncover or to sort of make these exact sharings more transparent. So this was just the first step towards this concern that what is actually happening once we give our data to this credit card company? Who is it sharing it with? What are the consequences of those sharings and etc.?
So these are all private, even if they're publicly traded companies, they're making private decisions. I don't imagine they necessarily publicize all of their data sharing policies and whatnot. Aren't these just black boxes? How can you get a peek inside?
So essentially what you have is these entities behaving as a black box, right? So we do know that the data goes to them, but we don't know how they share it with other entities. However, if there's anything we know about the advertising ecosystem, is that or the internet in general, it's that the internet is basically monetized through advertising. And all of this data is actually being gathered for the purpose of advertising. So if we can study how data that is being leaked to a specific entity ends up impacting the advertisements that you see that are being targeted at you, we can actually identify the relationships that exist between the entity that you leaked data to and the advertiser that put the ad in front of you. So in that way, by doing this systematically, we can figure out these relationships that might exist, even though all we can see is a black box from the outside.
And since I think we'll end up talking about this phrase a lot, could you give a roughly formal definition of what is behavioral targeting? Thanks to our sponsor, Neptune.ai. 99% of machine learning teams are doing awesome things at a reasonable scale with 4 people and 2 production models. But most of the industry best practices come from a handful of companies operating models at hyperscale. The folks over at Neptune.ai want to change that by sharing insights, tool stacks, and real-life stories from practitioners doing machine learning and ML ops at a reasonable scale. They even built a flexible tool for experiment tracking and model registry that will fit with your workflow at no scale, reasonable scale, and beyond. Check them out at Neptune.ai. What is behavioral targeting?
So behavioral targeting is one type of way in which advertisers present an ad to the user. And what's special about this is that it's based on the user that is seeing the ad. So it's based on the interests of the person who the ad is being delivered to.
And how does the platform that's serving the ad know what those interests are?
So that's the first part of the data ecosystem, which is gathering the data. So a tracker or an advertiser will be present on a lot of the websites and using techniques like cookies and tracking pixels and sharings on the back end. They gather information about a specific user. And when they see that user again somewhere, they know what their interests are, specifically their browsing history or likes or dislikes are, and they use that knowledge to present the user that ad. And that's basically behavioral advertising.
And there's some sort of, I guess I'll call it a non-obvious process, also a non-trivial process that's going on here, like a list of URLs you visited does not obviously convert into like a vector of interest or something like that. Are there standard techniques, or is this sort of a proprietary approach?
So this is a technique that has been used previously by other people as well, and by identifying a user's browsing history, you can make a well-educated guess on what kind of things they're interested in. So this is a technique that has been used in the community previously as well, and it's a well-accepted technique that browsing history can be used to represent interests of a user. It doesn't have to identify who you are or your exact details, but your interests are at least extracted from your browsing history, and that can be enough to present a more related ad to you.
Yeah, I mean, on the positive side, this sounds like a good thing. Like, I personally have no interest in soccer, so sending me any soccer ads is a waste of the advertising dollar and an annoyance to me. But if you look at my browser history, you would quickly see that I'm interested in machine learning and software development and stuff like that. And, even an ad that I'm not going to click on, I'd rather have a developer tool than a soccer ad. Where does this become insidious if it does?
So that's a very good question. We were talking about this recently as well, and in my personal opinion, it's not bad that trackers have your data or you're getting a personalized ads. What the issue is transparency. So our goal as well, as described in the paper as well, is to make these data flows more transparent. So we should know who is giving you that football ad and where did they get their data to. Because, for example, if something insidious does happen or something that sort of some of your personal data is being leaked or is being misused, you know who to hold accountable. And in addition to that, the policies, the data right policies, they also need these frameworks to hold data brokers or trackers accountable if something insidious does happen. So having these data flows or having these retargeted ads is not a bad thing until it becomes a bad thing. And then you need these auditing frameworks to sort of hold people accountable. So the main issue is accountability and transparency, not them existing in the ecosystem.
Yeah, just to present an alternate viewpoint about advertising not being bad, we just have to really think about how the internet is kept free today. We wouldn't have all these incredible services if it weren't for advertising generating enough revenue to fund all of these lovely internet services that we use, right? So it has done something good. I think where the issue lies is that people don't know what they're actually giving up to get something in return. And they don't have control. So there's no transparency and there's no control. And really what we're trying to develop here is a set of mechanisms that facilitates both transparency and then the user's right to control how their data is used and how it flows.
Well, that's a great segue right into Atom. Can you guys give me a definition of what the project's all about?
Yeah, so I think we've gone over the sentences somewhere in the previous question as well, but I'll go over it again. Atom focuses on analyzing what happens to your data once it is gathered and focuses on uncovering these data sharing relationships that are inside the black box you mentioned earlier to make the system, the data sharing ecosystem, more transparent.
And can we talk a bit about the mechanics? What's it doing to accomplish all that?
Okay, so there were two major parts of Atom. One was first where we had to establish that your ads can actually represent you, and the second was inferring these server-side relationships. So the first part, we instrumented an open source tool called OpenWPM, and we created these online profiles. Each represented an interest, for example, health, soccer, games, etc. And then we collected ads related that were presented to them. And then we compared those ads and we saw that an interest group within itself saw similar ads, but when compared to other interest groups, it saw different ads. So essentially, your ads and my ads would be different, and we were able to quantify that. And using this insight in the second part of this experiment, we exposed ourselves or leaked our data to certain combination of trackers, and then we saw how that affected our ads. And if that is affecting our ads, then we can say something about a relationship between that tracker that we exposed ourselves to and the advertiser that gave us our ad.
And is this a process where you and your team are, visiting specific sites and checking cookies, or is this a automated system? How does it all run?
It is an automated system. The first part and the second part both are automated. In the first part, we visit the given site. So we had 50 sites for each interest group. So health had 50 sites, games had 50 sites. We visited those 50 sites. We gathered all the cookies and things related to it, and then we went and collected ads from other sites as well. And the second part was leaking our data to certain trackers and then collecting ads for those profiles.
Gotcha. So those initial profile of URLs, that's kind of like a burn-in process where you're sort of teaching the internet, I guess, what your interests are.
Yeah.
In terms of collecting the ads, were these text ads or display ads? What did you get back?
Key contributions of Atom is that we are agnostic of the ad delivery methodology as well. So we to our best sort of instrumentation, we collect all kinds of ads that involves header bidding ads and RTB ads. That's real-time bidding ads and header bidding ads. So we try to collect all kinds of ads.
They're typically images, though.
They're typically images, yes, and we extract features from those images for analysis part as well. And those features include texts and other features like labels and entities, etc. So those are image ads, and we extract features from those.
Yeah, is that a tricky process? I know image recognition is pretty good, but just saying that, oh, there's a table and a chair in this photo doesn't necessarily mean it's home decor.
For sure, that's a difficult process. We did some validation with the annotations that we extract from the images. We used Google Cloud Platform's Vision API to annotate our images, and after annotating it, extracting all kinds of things like text, label, entities, context, and things like that, I went over and I manually validated the labeling as well. And turns out that things like the text extracted from the image or entities and things like that were more accurately extracted from the images and were also more representative of the ads as well as compared to other things like faces or the description of the background and things like that. So at the end, eventually it depended on things like text and entities from the pictures or ads that we extracted.
If you saw an ad for a laptop, where the laptop is open and floating in the air, right? And you've got the IBM logo right next to it, or the ThinkPad logo right next to it. Machine learning, is a lot better at extracting the presence of this logo and the text ThinkPad on in this image than it is in describing the laptop floating in the air with this color in the back, right? And it turns out that that is actually a really helpful way to describe these images because, as you might imagine, these ads that contain the word ThinkPad in them are more likely to be targeted towards individuals that are interested in tech, perhaps.
That's true, but we all have laptops, so there's going to be some background rate, I presume. if there weren't any server-side data sharing going on, we'd see, a uniform distribution here, I expect, across the groups. I imagine that's not what you get, though. How different from uniform are things when the interests are taken into account?
So to measure how different we would be from a control profile, by that I mean they didn't have any browsing history and we just collected ads from them. So we wanted to see what a new user would see. And turns out that our interest groups, across all interest groups, see a high difference from the control. So we all have laptops, but it turns out that a control profile is not receiving as many laptop ads as a tech profile would.
So I think there's a clarification to make, right? So far we've been talking about the first part of this project, which is the correlation between the ads that you see and the websites you've been browsing, right? So the second part, where we actually try to uncover these data sharing relationships, the way we do it is, let's say we're trying to figure out the data sharing relationship that exists between Alphabet and all of these other advertising organizations that exist, right? The way we go about doing this is we create a browsing profile and we allow Alphabet to see this browsing history, right? So we enable all of its trackers. We don't block any of them. So Alphabet gets to see all of the browsing history and the advertisers get to put ads in front of us. What we do next is we create the identical browsing profile. This time we make sure to block all of Alphabet's trackers. Of course, there's no guarantees of completeness, but we make a best effort from all of the crowdsourced data that exists to block access to all of Alphabet's trackers. And then we study how the ads delivered by these different entities actually changes, right? And then we compare statistically the ads we got from the first experiment where Alphabet got to see all of your data being or got to gather all of your data, and the second experiment where Alphabet did not get to observe you at all and has no data about you, right? And it turns out if there is a statistically significant difference between these two, it must be because Alphabet was sharing data with these advertisers.
What's the pool of advertisers look like? We'd mentioned Alphabet. Who else is in there? Are these names people would recognize?
The relationships that we uncover that includes advertisers like Alphabet. They also include advertisers like GumGum, Oracle, Facebook, and OpenX. So these are advertisers. So advertisers, and
those are the trackers.
So they're on the advertiser side as well.
All of them, because
the trackers we predetermined that the 10 big trackers that we wanted to infer relationships with, and the advertisers that we saw them having relationships with include OpenX, Trade Desk, PubMatic, Amazon, and other big names like Criteo and so forth. So this is the big names that come from the advertisers that we uncovered.
Let's get into the data. Do we find a certain independence across all these, or are you detecting some data sharing?
We can see that Alphabet, that's a good point, that we see that Alphabet, even though it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest data broker or company that consumes data, has relationships with essentially, it has the most relationships that we uncover. It has around, I think, 6 relationships that we uncover. So it looks like that even though these big entities are independent, they are interacting with each other as well, and they are sharing data with each other, because it only increases the data points that they have on a user. And the more data points you have on a user, the better you can target them and the better their ad money is spent. There's always gain for them to share data.
And another thing to keep in mind is that when we talk about data sharing, it's not necessarily looking like Alphabet's, zipping up these giant data sets and shipping it over to somebody else, right? It can also be as simple as Alphabet providing a platform through which people or advertisers can target different individuals. So Alphabet doesn't have to take your data and give it to someone else. It just provides a platform through which all of these advertisers can select the users they're interested in, and Alphabet does the targeting for them or on their behalf.
Was there anything surprising in the relationships you inferred?
Not as much, and we were able to validate most of our relationships through multiple ways. Except for a few of them, we used client-side cookie syncing or CCPA's disclosures to validate our relationships. But generally, we saw what we were expecting in terms of relationships that we uncovered.
I guess one thing that's a little bit surprising to me is that if you look at the paper, right, we've identified 10 different or 12 different sharing relationships that happen. Of these 12, only one of these could actually be validated by the CCPA. And that, to me, speaks about the CCPA actually not going far enough or not being followed through correctly, right? It's got to be one of the two. The CCPA is not mandating disclosures of all data sharing relationships, and so we're able to capture some that happen that we can't validate through the CCPA disclosures. And there exist 11 others, of which 9 could be validated through other very rudimentary techniques.
Well, if the CCPA is too weak or incomplete in some way, I mean, my feeling is that you go and you fix the policy, right? You improve it, you make it more specific or whatever. If the policy is sufficient but isn't being followed, that's another matter. And I know you may not have a sense of which bucket we're in, but are these people violating the CCPA, or could we put a percentage likelihood they're violating it on them?
I think that's a hard question to answer, just because we lack complete information, right? But these are the set of questions that Adam is actually trying to get at, right? So the goal is to put out all of these relationships, these 12 relationships, for example, that we identified out in the open, and then perhaps push these to the Attorney General in California and get them to investigate this more. They are going to have more access to information than we do. They're going to be able to get the information that they need to verify that these are still in compliance or not in compliance with the CCPA. Or even verify that they're not required to disclose these relationships by the CCPA.
And I don't know how exactly we'd frame it or what the units are, but do you have any sense from the results in your work of the degree to which the sharing is taking place? Is this something we would say is rampant or is in an R&D phase? I guess how significant is it?
Based on the results that we have, I would say sharing definitely is prevalent. To reduce sort of false positives, we were very strict with the threshold that we set out, and still we got like 12 of these relationships. We used very basic features, which was text of the image. If we have more context of the ads that we're receiving, or if we have more powerful models, we can essentially uncover more, because there definitely is more that is happening. We were very conservative, so we get true positives in our inferences, I believe.
The other thing to look at is when you look at our results, right? The advertisers that end up receiving gathered data or being part of the sharing ecosystem are giant ones. We're talking about Criteo, we're talking about Amazon, PubMatic, Trade Desk. These are huge. And the trackers that we're seeing frequently sharing information with them belong to Oracle, Alphabet, GumGum, OpenX, and Facebook. Again, massive trackers. To answer your question, I would say it's probably really, really prevalent, the sharing of this data, just given the size of the tracking entities and the advertising entities that we're seeing these relationships between.
So in this work, you guys had to go to a great effort to collect this data set. We've only touched on that. I get the sense of some of the engineering challenges we might not have even touched on. This was not an easy project, and it's there to then be an audit. I guess another way we could look at it, if the Attorney General thought this was relevant, or if the CCPA was expanded, is maybe these companies could be forced to do some form of disclosure, maybe not giving you root access to their systems, but sharing some level of information. Do you have any thoughts on what would be useful for them to share for an outside auditor to be monitoring these sorts of data sharing policies?
For starter, if they disclose the third parties that they share the data with, that would be a positive thing that would help in auditing as well. And generally, just share what they're doing with the data, which covers how they're collecting it, what they're collecting, and who they're sharing it with. I think these are important things for consumers to know as well, and for auditing frameworks or for policy enforcers as well. They would be a good start, I would say.
Yeah, one thing to keep in mind is, it's likely that behind each of these sharing relationships is a business contract. This is something that's non-technical evidence potentially for the existence of sharing relationships, right? Usually these contracts are going to specify exactly the type of things that might be traded between these entities. And so it seems to me like these are things that, regulators behind, the CCPA or similar protection mechanisms would be able to get a lot, access to and use more effectively.
And let's see, you'd mentioned that the Atom system is pretty much fully automated. That means, at least from a technology point of view, it can scale up. Do you have any plans for where the project's going in the future?
The follow-up of this work is focused on the validation part, and we're trying to look at how the data brokers are compliant with regulatory policies like CCPA.
One of the things I'll actually push back on what you just said is, you were right that Atom is fully automated, but I would argue that we actually do not have the ability to scale very much at all. This was a massive engineering effort that took a ridiculous amount of compute, and honestly, I don't know how Maaz managed to pull it off. It was pretty ridiculous, the system that he ended up building to do this. It was incredible. However, for example, in this paper, all we were able to do was study 10 trackers and identify the relationships that they had with advertisers, right? So that's not really speaking to scale. In upcoming work, we're trying to make this a little bit more scalable. One of the goals that we have is to establish relationships with enforcement agencies so that we can actually push these sharing relationships that we're identifying, they're not disclosed as part of the CCPA, to the regulatory authorities so they can start their investigations, or they can use this as statistical evidence to motivate an investigation going forward, right? So that's one angle that we're looking at. Then the second angle that we're looking at is just trying to understand exactly what the CCPA requires a data broker to do. And so we're working with some of our legal friends to help us understand the regulations, and then actually studying whether these data brokers are complying with each aspect of the CCPA.
And I know you can't give me a solid answer to this question, because how could you know? But based on the initial results you have here, could we label the degree to which companies are in violation? Are these flagrant violations, or are these, the growing pains of rolling out a policy? To what extent are things not as they might seem, I guess?
We're still in the initial stages of these follow-up projects, but the analysis I've done so far, which is very limited, I can see that there might be several shortcomings, and for these data brokers and organizations that deal with data, even though they're the actual registered data brokers on the Attorney General's website, you can very obviously see some very straightforward shortcomings, but we still have those results are just preliminary and still need more better or deeper analysis to make a actual statement.
There's a lot of meaty research to be done.
Makes sense.
Right? There's so many open problems, and there's a lot of compliance issues to study.
What's the future for both Atom and your own work?
The future for Atom, again, is firstly establishing a good way to scale this up, or to use this for as an application for maybe for a Attorney General's office or something, and then the other part would be seeing the compliance of these relationships that we have uncovered, I guess. Yeah.
And is there anywhere listeners can follow both of you online?
So I'm active on Twitter and email and LinkedIn, so I can be reached out on all these three platforms.
I'm on Twitter at RishabN_. There's another Rishab N. I'm not that guy.
All right, well, we'll have correct links to both in the show notes.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much for taking the time to come on and share your work.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Well, that's it for today's episode. The advent of this text-to-image technology we're now seeing everywhere on the internet, Without a doubt, that's going to make an impact on the advertising space. But prior to these computer vision breakthroughs, we had breakthroughs in natural language processing, and models like GPT-3 that could be used to write things like job ads.
They essentially showed how likely it is that different genders would apply for jobs if they read job advertisements with these stereotypical words. One proximal goal that's to maybe have equal probabilities of applying for a particular position.
That's next week on Data Skeptic Ad Tech.